this morning we are going to have our first presentation. The first presentation that we will have is Dr. Lowell Cooper. Lowell Cooper is a retired minister. He's a former vice president of the General Conference. And when we invited Dr. Cooper, it was a few months ago. And we were delighted to have his agreement to do that because there are two things that we wanted Dr. Cooper to share with us. The first one is his vision about what we call mission. And I believe that as he will also be sharing the spiritual messages with us today and tomorrow, it is something that he will help us understand when we talk about mission in the Adventist world, what are we talking about? And the second thing, this is what he will present to us today. We also have a challenge, and this is very important that we cope with this challenge, so to say. But beyond that we understand the very importance of governance in our healthcare institutions. For information, I want to remind you of one fact. This symposium is an hybrid program. Today and tomorrow, we are going to talk of healthcare services, hospitals, clinics, medical brigades, etc., everything that we are doing when we are providing healthcare services. This is very important that we look at this, but also we will talk about health systems, health ministries, what we do in our churches. Most of the time, we don't do that together. You will see that this seems to be two different words. And the challenge we have is to figure out how we are going to have them becoming one word. This vision of integration, this vision of oneness. And so with me, I'm going to ask you to help me to welcome Dr. Lowell Cooper, he will make this presentation difference between governance at the church level versus governance at our institution level. Dr. Cooper?
It's good to meet with you this morning and to launch into our day. We have a complex topic. I understand that these slide things that we'll show this morning will be shared with you. You will find as we go through them that things are rather dense. I realize that I've put far too much information on a slide for entertainment value, but maybe for educational value. The material will be helpful to you in time to come as you refer to it. I've been asked to talk about church and institutional relationships, what boards and their leaders need to know. There's a slide here about how you can use this. You are free to use this information, not to commercialize it, but to use it for educational purposes. Our objective this morning is to comprehend prominent aspects of church and church-sponsored institutional relationships. Secondly, we want to enrich the understanding of how the church and institutions participate in a shared mission. And thirdly, to enhance governing board performance in celebrating, preserving, and strengthening church and church-sponsored institutional relationships. Dr. Frank has already underscored this idea that the church and healthcare institution need to function as a team, to come into alignment and complementarity. And we want to explore aspects about that. So we begin by considering a little bit about Seventh-day Adventist organizational structure. I'm not going to read all these numbers, but here you get an impression of the ecclesiastical side of church organization. And immediately, I think you'll realize that we're not a small organization. We're a very complex and large organization. This is just the ecclesiastical information. When we add to that the institutional side of things, educational institutions, food industries, healthcare institutions, etc., you see that we indeed have expanded our complexity and our presence in the world. If we were to look just at the healthcare side of things, here again, we have almost 2,000 entities between hospitals, sanitariums, care facilities, and medical and dental clinics. So we're not talking of some small, isolated part of church structure and engagement in mission. So we want to talk about how church and institutions relate, and particularly the healthcare institutions, since this is a health leadership symposium. And I want to talk about nine facets of our relationship. We will go through them rather quickly. And at the end, I hope there will be some time for a few questions. We want to talk about mission and methods, identity, structure, governance, property, resources, employees, policies, and a local church on an institution campus. That's often an interesting part of our denominational life and relationships. So let's begin with mission and methods. I realize that this morning we're talking to some church leaders and some healthcare institution leaders. It's important for us to understand our mission and our methodologies. You are acquainted, I suppose, with the Seventh-day Adventist Church mission statement. The mission of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is, notice the verbs, to call all people to become disciples of Jesus Christ, to proclaim the everlasting gospel embraced by the three angels' messages, and to prepare the world for Christ's soon return. Okay, to call, to proclaim, to prepare. Those are the verbal ideas in our mission statement. But did you also know that we have a statement of methods? I think throughout my participation in leadership in the church, there's been a lot of emphasis on understanding our mission statement. Very, very little attention has been given to our methods statements. I think our method statements shed a great deal of light on our mission. And in the General Conference Working Policy, I think you'll find this in the Division Working Policy also, guided by the Bible and the Holy Spirit, Seventh-day Adventists pursue this mission through, notice these 6 things: Christ-like living, Christ-like communicating, Christ-like discipling, Christ-like teaching, Christ-like healing, and Christ-like serving. Did you notice those 6 methodologies? Now, when we talk about relationship of church and denominational institutions, and we think about missions and methods, we need to have a deeper understanding of these things. So I'm going to give you, we have in our policy book, we have a statement about Christ-like living, Christ-like communication, discipling, and teaching. I have pictured for you here the statement about Christ-like healing, affirming the biblical principles of the well-being of the whole person. We make healthful living and the healing of the sick a priority. And through our ministry to the poor and oppressed, cooperate with the Creator in his compassionate work of restoration. That is one of 6 sentences about our methodology. There's also one about Christ-like serving. And if we were to have an ADRA conference, for instance, or a community service conference, we'd focus on that one. But I want us to understand our statement of methodology with respect to healing and health. Now let's compare them. Let's compare the mission of ecclesiastical entities and the mission of healthcare entities when we think of our methodologies. Let's begin with our denominational or ecclesiastic, our church structure. Our mission is that we have a local and global comprehensive spiritual renewal. That's a focus of all our churches, all of our conferences, unions, divisions, etc., to advance a spiritual growth in our membership. There's a focus on worship, on discipleship, and proclamation. You find those three verbs in the mission statement. Okay? We embrace multiple methodologies and our evaluation of ecclesiastical success. There are many ways, but one of the principal ways that we keep people informed about is membership accessions. That's a very key indicator for us about the advance of church mission around the world. It's a key indicator of success at a local church. I think there are other indicators that we should give attention to, but we spend a lot of emphasis on the matter of membership accessions. Now let's take a look at the healthcare institution mission and methodology and compare it to the ecclesiastical mission and methodology. Well, the mission of a healthcare institution, be it a clinic or an institution or a care home, etc., is to continue the healing ministry of Jesus. You look at the mission statements of many of our healthcare institutions, and they center around that theme that we're doing a healing ministry patterned on the ministry and the example of Jesus. We embrace spirituality within the concept of wholeness. This is a kind of a new concept. We haven't expressed it that clearly in our ecclesiastical mission statement. We bring into our healing methodology a new concept of the wholeness of the person. We'll talk a little bit more about that maybe tonight and tomorrow. We stimulate spiritual inquiry through Christ-like ministry. Our healthcare institutions do not normally conduct evangelistic series, a series of 21 meetings on prophecy and so forth. That's not typical of a healthcare institution. But we want our healthcare institutions and all healthcare entities to be seed sowing enterprises. We saw that in the video last night from Dr. Handesides, and also the introductory video where Ellen White wrote so clearly about health ministry. We stimulate spiritual inquiry through Christ-like ministry. And a healthcare institution is evaluated in terms of quality, service, and patient outcome. You see there immediately a difference. We said we evaluate ecclesiastical entity functions and success, at least partly in terms of membership accessions. When it comes to a healthcare institution, the question we would ask is not how many people were baptized by the hospital. The question we should be asking is, what are the quality metrics in this institution? That is what is going to make an institution distinctive. It is what is going to create this spiritual inquiry because of the excellence that we embrace. Service and patient outcomes. These are going to be the ways that we evaluate and we assess and we analyze a healthcare institution. Notice it's complementary to the ecclesiastical functions, but it is different from the ecclesiastical functions and the ecclesiastical evaluations. Church-sponsored institutions are an expression of the church in mission. All right? They're not separate from the church. They are an expression of the church in mission. And simply because there is a discrete and a focused kind of activity does not in any way remove the institution from the life of the church. They are an essential part of the mission consciousness of the entire church. Institutions fill unique roles in mission. We cannot say they just fill unique roles. They are unique roles in the mission of the church. They cannot go unnoticed or disrespected by ecclesiastical structure or measured in terms of membership acquisitions. Nor should church institutions distance themselves from the church by independent mindedness and inattention to all dimensions of wholeness in life. I hope we understand here this idea that has been kind of the motivating factor for this whole conference, that we think about alignment in comprehensive health ministry. Institutions cannot move away from the church in an attitude of independence, nor can they be absorbed by the church and treated like another congregation. All right? Our mission is the same in many ways. Our methodology and our uniqueness is what distinguishes us. So we've talked about mission and methods. Let's talk a little bit about identity. We said there were nine facets of church and institutional relationship. The second one deals with identity. And we make several points here about healthcare institutions, that the institution needs to be identified as a faith-based ministry. Okay? It's not just a business. It's not just a corporate enterprise. It is a faith-based ministry. The institution proactively exhibits to clients its alignment with the healing ministry and presence of Jesus Christ. There ought to be no hesitation, absolutely no hesitation, for any of our healthcare entities to be identified with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, because we participate in the Seventh-day Adventist Church mission. Number two, there's linkage to faith-based organization. The institution is internally and publicly portrayed and recognized as sponsored by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. When I visit various institutional websites, I often look for how the website identifies the entity and its connection to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I think in the signage that we put up, the physical signage that we put up on our buildings and so forth, also is a great opportunity for us to ensure that we are communicating to the public that this entity is connected to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Thirdly, mission purpose and linkage are embedded. Staff orientation and programs positively portray the affiliation of the institution and the church. Notice we are not saying that the institution is the church, but it is connected with the church. There is a tight connection between the institution and its functions and its sponsoring organization, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Institutional identity and participation in the Seventh-day Adventist Church mission and values occurs. Notice, identity and participation in the Seventh-day Adventist Church is structured in several ways. First of all, through a constituency, or through the membership of the organization. And our policies require that the membership of the organization will be Seventh-day Adventists. The second way is that the board members of an institution are Seventh-day Adventists. There are some exceptions to that, and our policy recognizes that, where government regulations require, in order to obtain a license or a permit to function as an institution, sometimes government regulations require that the government has the opportunity, has the authority to name someone to the board, the governing body. Our policy allows that. Apart from that, our policy says that the governing body of a Seventh-day Adventist institution is going to be comprised of Seventh-day Adventists. Further, we expect that the management, the executive leadership, is going to be representative of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And to an extent, as far as possible, we'll talk about this a little bit later, even the employees. We have to recognize that in the healthcare ministry of the church worldwide, this is probably an area where we have the greatest challenge in attracting and employing everyone as a Seventh-day Adventist. There are some things we need to discuss about that, and that not need to present us an insurmountable problem. But what we're trying to say here is that we have structured in church policy the identity and the preservation of an identity of an institution as Seventh-day Adventist. It's structured through the way we compose the membership, the way we select the board, the way we select executive leadership and management. All right. Now, number 5, corporate conduct is expected to demonstrate Seventh-day Adventist teachings, values, ethics, and lifestyle. The institution looks a lot like its sponsor. All right, we're talking about issues in identity. Let's move on now to structure. The third component that we're thinking of when we talk about the areas of relationship between ecclesiastical entities and institutions. Let's think about structure. I've put here a pattern that exists both in ecclesiastical entity and in the institutional entity. You'll see there's a great deal of similarity. Let's look on the left side of the screen to begin with. In ecclesiastical entities, we have a constituency or a membership. You know, a local conference has a periodic constituency meeting. A union has a constituency meeting. That's the way that the membership expresses its authority. That constituency appoints or elects an executive committee and executive officers of in the administration of the entity. That's the pattern we see in the ecclesiastical side of things. Let's look at how that pattern is applied in institutional entities. Again, we have a constituency or a membership. This is generally a fairly large body that functions, let me say this carefully, that functions as if it owns the institution. Now, in reality, not-for-profit organizations do not have owners. I think that's a reality around the world. A not-for-profit organization doesn't have shareholders, but it has people who function as if they were owners to protect and preserve and to maintain the organization. So at the highest level of authority in institutional structures, we have this constituency or membership that meets once in maybe 4 or 5 years, and it elects a board of trustees. The board of trustees generally, there are some exceptions to this, the board of trustees generally elects the chief executive officer and appoints the key people in administration. There's an interesting difference here between ecclesiastical structure and institutional structure. In the ecclesiastical structure, when there is a constituency meeting, the constituency not only elects the executive committee, but it also elects the officers of the organization. In the institutional structures, and there may be some variation in pattern, but as a general statement, in the institutional structures, the membership or constituency meeting elects the board. And the board then appoints the executive administration. That's different from church structure. Let's move on. We need to talk about the distinctness of organizations. Ecclesiastical structure and institutional structure are not one and the same. They are different, yet closely related. The church entity is a sponsor, not an owner. We need to think about, the language that we use in describing relationships. If we are to say that the church owns this institution, attorneys would like to use that language against us. It creates ascending liability if we create too tight a connection. And that's why our institutions have separate identity. Okay? Church and institution are separate legal persons. Legal personhood is accomplished through status as a corporation or as allowed under a local jurisdiction. I think the most common way is through a corporation. So the healthcare entity will not be organized as a church. It will be organized as a corporation. Now, in our interface and involvement in the ecclesiastical side of structure, most of what we do is through an unincorporated status. Local churches are not corporations. The function of the local conference, the union, the division, the general conference, most of its work is done through an unincorporated function. General conference has a corporation. The division, I suppose, has a corporation. Unions sometimes have a corporation in order to own property, etc. But the evangelism activity, the mission of the church is accomplished through unincorporated status. Healthcare institutions, on the other hand, are incorporated. That means they have legal personality. They can be sued. All right. They, in the eyes of the government, they are treated as a person. Number 3 here is important. Our healthcare entities, let's say our educational institutions and so forth, need to be registered as charitable, religious, and not-for-profit organizations wherever possible. Now, I would think every country in the United States, it's every state, has a not-for-profit organization code. And you need to go online, for the government of that state and find its not-for-profit organizational code. We say that it is important for healthcare institutions to be registered as charitable, religious, and not-for-profit. That's incredibly important where that is possible within the regulations of the government to be registered that way. There is a case here in the United States of a university in New York that is recognized. It's a Jewish university. But when it registered itself as a charitable educational institution. Somehow or other, I don't know how that could possibly have happened. Somebody forgot to say we are a charitable religious educational institution. And so an issue came up last year with this university about government laws respecting LGBTQ and so forth. And this university was required to grant facilities to the LGBTQ club on campus because it was an educational institution. If it had been registered as a religious educational institution, it could have availed itself of federal provisions that protect the right of religious organizations. You see? So it's very important that we examine how we are registered with the government. What kind of organization are we? And wherever possible, if that is permissible in the code of the government, we need to be identified as a religious organization. Number 4, separate and distinct structure isolates risk exposure and allows for business development not available to an ecclesiastical structure. Now, you see, many of our organizations in various parts of the world receive public assistance, government assistance, and so forth in the educational endeavor. We couldn't do that as a church. So one of the reasons that we have a separate identity is that we limit risk exposure to the church, and we are able to carry on a business activity that would not be available to a church structure. Distinct legal structure does not infer or confer a mindset of independence from church interests. You need to be very deliberate and thoughtful about, because we are separate does not mean we are independent in mind and in outlook. All right, our structure, our corporate healthcare structures might also involve affiliations, subsidiaries, partnerships, or other configurations required or permitted by licensing organizations. And another feature that we need to understand in this relationship is if a healthcare institution, or an educational institution for that matter, were to be dissolved, the residual assets of the institution are transferred to a designated church entity. That is in our governance documents. If you look at the constitution and bylaws of your organization, there should be a clause there that says what happens if your organization folds up. Okay, let's talk a little bit about governance. We've looked at mission methods, identity, structure. Now let's launch into a little bit about governance. And this can be a bit complicated for us. We have two governance systems in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Let's talk about how we would compare the two. The ecclesiastical system, that is the church side of things, and the institutional system. First of all, the governing body in the church, we call the executive committee. In the institution, we call the governing body the board of trustees or the board of directors. Now, I don't know what happens when we translate these terms into other languages, whether we have this same kind of, this equivalence of function, but difference of description. The interesting and sometimes the puzzling part of it is that in the institutional system, while we have the board of directors as the governing body, that board may also have an executive committee. And I have found church leaders who get quite confused on this. They think the executive committee in an institution is equivalent to an executive committee in the ecclesiastical system in terms of its authority. It is not the same. It is not the same. The executive committee in the ecclesiastical system is comparable in terms of authority and governance responsibility to the board in the institutional system. Let's go on. In the ecclesiastical system, the membership meeting elects the executive committee. In the institutional system, the membership elects the board. So there's a there's an equivalency there in function. In the ecclesiastical system, the membership meeting also elects the president, the secretary, and the treasurer. But in the institutional system, generally, I realize there are some exceptions and alternatives, but generally, in the institutional system, it's the board that appoints the officers. That is a very significant difference in governance structure. In the ecclesiastical system, each entity is a part of a chain of organizations. We have a connected chain: local church, local conference, union, division, general conference. There's kind of a chain relationship there. And if a local church encounters some kind of an issue or something, it can refer that to the conference for advice and counsel. In the institutional system, we don't have that kind of connection. Each entity is a standalone organization. Now, I realize that we have some healthcare systems where a number of institutions are collectively identified within a system. And yet, each of these entities is still a standalone organization. Each one will have its own legal personality. This is somewhat different from ecclesiastical structure. In the ecclesiastical system, where we have an executive committee as the governing body, there will usually be many employees on that governing body. But in the institutional system, the board will have very few employees. Sometimes only one employee. The president of the institution will be a member of the board. I chaired an institution for a number of years that had no employees of the institution on the board. Absolutely none. The president of the entity was an invitee, had speaking authority, but could not vote. That is very, very different from the ecclesiastical structure. In the ecclesiastical structure, the chair of the executive committee is from that organization. The president of the local conference is the chair of the executive committee. The president of the union is the chair of the executive committee. In the institution, it's different. The chair of the board for an institution is external to the institution. Generally, an executive person in the ecclesiastical side of denominational structure. So this is a very, very significant difference in the governance structure of church entities and institutional entities. You need to realize how different it is when you don't have any employees on the board. How do you get information? How do you know what's happening in the institution? When you have the chairperson of the executive committee who is part of the organization, that's a very different, it's a very different combination from having a chairperson who comes from outside the organization. So let's recognize those differences. Number two, number whatever it is, in the ecclesiastical system, officers report to the executive committee. The three officers, we say in ecclesiastical structure, we do not follow a presidential system. We follow a team system. And so we generally have three: president, secretary, treasurer. In the institutional side of things, we generally lean towards a presidential system where the CEO is the one who reports to the board. In the ecclesiastical system, generally the executive committee is more involved in management, and in the institutional system, less involved in management. That relates directly to the composition of the governing body. When you have board members of a healthcare institution who come from outside the institution, it's very difficult for them, more challenging for them to get involved in management. They will try at times, but that line is a little more clearly defined in institutional life than in ecclesiastical systems. We've said already, we've talked about the unincorporated status for churches and the corporate status for institutions. Let's move on. Institutional governance is distinct from church governance. Each entity has a defined constituency, usually comprised entirely of Seventh-day Adventist members and leaders. The constituency or membership elects the board. The board chair is generally filled by an ex officio executive in an ecclesiastical unit. The board is the governing body of the institution with ultimate authority. It can only be exceeded by the constituency or a regulatory agency. I hope we are all understanding what is not written there. The executive committee of a church entity does not have authority to dictate what happens in an institution. Remember, our distinct identity is separate. It's not independent. We need to understand the distinction between the ideas of separateness and independence. Denominational institutions are not independent. We are interdependent in church life. The institutional board size and composition is prescribed in the institution bylaws. That's our governance documents. And the board of trustees is responsible for linking the institution to the interests of the constituency and thus ultimately to the church. So here's a very critical function of board members in an institution. They keep the institution linked to the mission and identity of the church. Let's move on. What is new here? I'll let you look at these two slides. I see the time is going by. A fundamental understanding we need to have by church leadership, and I say by church leadership because it is church leaders who are often ex officio members on institution boards. And a church leader will be the chair of the institution board. What's important for us to understand here is that a church leader may wear many hats, but should only wear one hat at a time. Okay. When you're functioning as the chair of an institution board, your responsibility, your obligation, your functioning has to be for the interests of that institution. I sat in on a meeting of an organization one time. It was a Seventh-day Adventist institution, not an executive committee of an ecclesiastic function. And there was a difficult subject that was being discussed, and there was some tension among the board members. And finally, the chairperson, who was the union president, said, "Let's refer this matter to the union executive committee. I have more power there." Oh. Huge mistake. Huge mistake. Let's not perpetuate that idea. All right. I want to talk a little bit about property. We're looking at the 9 areas of relationship between church and institutions. Property. The question we need to ask about at an institution is the property used by the institution owned by the institution? Is it rented or is it leased? If it is rented or leased, what are the terms? We lived overseas for a number of years, and one of the institutions we had there had a 99-year lease for property, leased from a business corporation. In the 97th year of the lease, the board of this institution voted a building project without being aware that this is the 97th year of a 99-year lease that needed to be renegotiated. And here they were going to invest several $1 million on property they didn't own. that they only lease? So these are questions board members need to ask. If it's rented or leased, what are the terms? There's a widespread denominational practice that title to real estate is held in the name of a church entity. And that's why I said, many of our denominational entities will have a corporate structure. There may be a conference corporation or a union corporation. And one of the purposes of that is to hold title to property. Generally, all of the property of the local church is held in the conference corporation. In many of our institutions, the property is held, the title to the property is held by a church entity, and a lease arrangement is given to the institution. So these property considerations are very important. The church entity corporation, if holding title to institutional property, holds title in trust for the institution. Sometimes executive committees forget that. They think, the institution has this amount of property. We need a little bit of money. Let's sell off a corner of the institution property for the benefit of the church. No. If the church owns title to property, it owns that as a protective thing, not as not to take advantage of that. It owns it for the sake of the institution. Let's move on. Transactions affecting the property, security for loans, permits to build, divide, lease, rent, sell, will require approval from the title holding company. My local church is at present time undergoing an arrangement to rent the church to a Lutheran church. Their building burnt down yesterday. And they approached our church pastor and said, can we rent your property? We have no place to meet. And so right now, my local church board is feverishly involved in setting up a rental agreement, but we cannot conclude the agreement. It has to be approved by the conference corporation because the conference corporation has title to our property. Ownership of real property includes land and buildings. Major alterations may require title holder approval. Well, we've got to rush on. My time is about up here. Resources, that's another area of relationship between institutions and the church. The institution board needs to understand several dimensions of financial relationships with ecclesiastical structure. These include, does the institution receive appropriations from the church? Does the institution practice profit sharing with the church sponsor? What do we do about institution tithe? Is that a fundamental belief or a policy practice of the Seventh-day Adventist Church? What about employee tithe that is collected by the institution? And what about loan arrangements, including loan security? These relationships often have to be carefully sorted out. Let's make a few generalized comments here. Any financial arrangement between a church entity and a church-sponsored institutions needs to respect organizational boundaries. Minutes of the governing body, that is the executive committee and the church and the board of the institution, need to document the financial arrangement. Informal arrangements on money issues must be avoided. The church entity sponsoring the institution may grant appropriations to the institution. Now, this is not a requirement. Let's be absolutely clear about that. The intention, the hope, the desire, the plan of church institutions is that they be able to operate on their own without assistance from the church. But we realize in many cases, there are provisions that the church makes for appropriations to the institution. But the idea, the ideal is for the institution to strive to attain self-support. Appropriations from the sponsoring organization should not be considered a perpetual feature of relationship. We had someone one time from an organization that suggested that the way that the church owns an institution, or the way that a church sponsors an institution, is by giving it money. No, that's a misunderstanding of church and institutional relationships. An institution's board may choose to share a portion of operational surplus with the sponsoring body after making reasonable provision for depreciation and capital needs. I've known of some organizations that do that. They have an operating surplus at the end of a fiscal year, and they will make some donation towards the sponsoring entity of the church. But any proposed surplus sharing with the sponsoring body should not be factored into the institutional cost reporting submitted to the government or insurance companies for cost reimbursement. You know, we can't go to the government and say, we need more money from the government for treating patients because we give part of our money to the church. That will never work. That will be very complicated and complicating. Although the Bible does not specifically address the topic of institutional tithing, such tithing would be and is an expression of gratitude to the Lord for the blessings he's bestowed on the organization. It's an act of solidarity with the church. And according to General Conference working policy, the practice of institutional tithing is encouraged by church leaders, but it is not mandated by policy. All right. Although other funds may be available and should be used first, chaplains serving in schools and hospitals may also be paid from tithe. Let's move on. Some institutions deduct employee tithe from the payroll rather than having employees return tithe through local church channels. That was true in the area of the world that we worked in Southern Asia. The preferred arrangement is for employees to personally return tithe through the local church. Employing agencies that deduct tithe from the employee payroll run the risk of employees viewing tithe as tax rather than as a relationship with God. Be very, very, very careful about the automatic deduction of tithe from employees. Institutions that follow a tithe deduction program need to have in place an employee authorization to do so. When we worked overseas, every employer I had, I had given authorization to deduct tithe from my salary. Returning tithe is an act of stewardship that needs to be a person's decision rather than the organization's mandate. Employing units that deduct tithe from the payroll must forward in a regular and timely manner to the church that tithe. And tithe deducted from employee payroll must not be viewed as institutional resources. Otherwise, the entire concept of employee participation in stewardship is subverted to institutional purposes. I wish we had more time. Let's talk about employees. In General Conference working policy, there's this statement: in the employment of persons in every capacity, whether in an office environment, an institution, or otherwise, great diligence shall be used to employ qualified persons who are members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Now, we understand the advisability of that kind of a policy. We also recognize that hospitals and healthcare institutions probably face the greatest challenge in all of our church structure of having 100% Seventh-day Adventist employees. That I don't know that exists in many places. Hospitals and other healthcare institutions shall make no distinction on the basis of race, color, or gender in admitting patients or in making their facilities available to physicians, interns, residents, nurses, and administrators. All organizations and institutions shall provide employment and advancement opportunities without regard to race, color, or gender to persons who qualify. This whole area of human relations and employment practices and policies is under a great deal of stress around the world. And we'll have tremendous stress on religious organizations. Our institutions will face that much more directly than our church entities. Across the spectrum of Seventh-day Adventist institutions, it's generally the healthcare institutions that have the greatest challenge in attracting sufficient numbers of qualified church members. The central question is how to attract a workforce that individually and collectively implements the mission of the institution. Does a Seventh-day Adventist workforce guarantee that the spiritual mission of the institution will be advanced? Not necessarily. Unfortunate, not necessarily. Can an institution's spiritual mission be advanced without careful attention to the convictions and motivations of its employees? Decidedly no. Decidedly no. So it's the spiritual convictions and commitments of the institution's staff that will create the institution's reputation as providing Christ-like ministry. Moving on quickly. Let's go to policies. The board is the policy-making body for the institution. Denominational policy and fundamental beliefs form a backdrop for institutional policy development, but the board is the policy-making body. In some instances, denominational policy already predetermines certain aspects of institutional life. Sometimes that can be in the area of remuneration policies and so forth. Let's look at, what are the policy documents that we have for institutions? Our organizational structure, there's general conference and division working policy that would describe how organizations, how institutions are structured, the composition of the constituency, the composition of the board, what is embraced in the Seventh-day Adventist health message. Risk management policies are also already given for institutions, remuneration policy for some institutions, and remuneration wage scale may be subject to division policy. So again, we're seeing this relationship of the institution to the church. The General Conference Working Policy has a variation for commercial business organizations in which the remuneration can reflect prevailing remuneration levels in the market rather than following strictly a denominational wage scale. Within the perimeter of denominational policy, each institution board is free to adopt operational policies for the institution and for the board itself. We come to the last of these 9 items before we entertain questions for a moment or two. That is the local church on an institution campus. This can sometimes be a fruitful ground for tension. Denominational institutions and other legal entities, by virtue of a relatively high concentration of Seventh-day Adventist employees in one location, also need to maintain a clear and mutually beneficial relationship with the local Seventh-day Adventist church. In many cases, the church building may be located on the campus of the institution, and a high percentage of local church membership is employed by the institution. In these situations, it's important to preserve a distinction between the functions of the institution and the role of the local church. Let me just say, the pastors of the local church are employees of the conference. The local church remains a member unit of the conference. Therefore, the administration of the institution and the pastors of the local churches have to learn to work together and to be aware of each other's needs and each other's agendas and schedules. Okay? We've talked about 9 areas of relationship between ecclesiastical entities of the church and institutions. I think we have a few minutes for questions. Looks like we have maybe 7 minutes. And I'll entertain questions if you have questions. Maybe this was so clear it put you to sleep. Yes, brother.
Because we have folks in Zoom, so we're going to need to use the mic.
Okay, microphone is coming.
Thank you. You use the word sponsored organization, like the church. I almost say the word owned organization, but sponsor is often understood as giving finances. So is there another word we can find?
Oh, my goodness. I suppose we'd have to give some thought to that in the English language. I don't know how it would be translated elsewhere. But the idea that we use in the term sponsor, and it's in our policies and so forth, that's the preferred term. The idea there is to distinguish between, support and owning. And support can either be missional support, psychological support, and so forth, as opposed to financial support. Sometimes sponsoring does involve financial support, but there are many organizations that are sponsored but get no financial report. They are still sponsored. All right, any other question? Again, I say you can have access to these slides, and I suppose in reviewing them in the future, questions will come to you. That's often the case. The most important questions come after the meeting is over. But it will allow you to think through the principles that have been identified in relationship. I think we are incredibly blessed as a global church family to have so many institutions that are carrying on unique roles in the mission of the church. Thank you very much.